The autumn of 1976 brought an unusual quiet to the college campuses, scattered across the industrial corridor between Cleveland and Akron. It was a silence that would later be understood not as peace, but as the methodical removal of voices that should have been heard in lecture halls, dormitories, and weekend gatherings where young minds wrestled with the possibilities of their futures. The first disappearance occurred on September 15th, when Jennifer Walsh, name altered, failed to return to her dormitory at Oberlin College. Her roommate initially assumed she had decided to spend an extra night with her boyfriend in nearby Elyria, but when Monday classes began without her, the concern became official. Jennifer was a pre-med student, disciplined and predictable in her routines. She had driven her parents' borrowed Chevrolet Impala to visit home that weekend. But the car was found abandoned at a rest stop along Route 20, keys still in the ignition, purse untouched on the passenger seat. 3 weeks later, on October 7th, another Jennifer vanished. Jennifer Morrison, name altered, was a sophomore at Case Western Reserve University, studying psychology with plans to become a counselor for troubled youth. She had told friends she was driving to visit her grandmother in Medina, taking her usual route through the back roads that connected the sprawling suburban developments to the older farming communities. Her Plymouth Duster was discovered 2 days later in the parking lot of an abandoned steel mill, positioned carefully between two rusted shipping containers as if someone had wanted it to remain hidden for as long as possible. The connection seemed obvious only in retrospect. Two Jennifers, both college students, both disappeared while traveling alone on weekends. But in 1976, information moved slowly between jurisdictions, and the idea that someone might be specifically targeting young women based on their first names seemed too bizarre for serious consideration. The investigating officers in each county filed their reports, conducted their interviews, and waited for leads that never materialized. The pattern became undeniable when the third Jennifer disappeared on November 12th. Jennifer Kowalski, name altered, was a senior at Kent State University, a quiet young woman who had survived the campus turmoil of 1970 and chosen to complete her education at the same institution where she had witnessed history's darker moments. She was driving home to her family's house in Youngstown, a journey she had made dozens of times in her reliable Honda Civic. But Jennifer Kowalski never arrived home, and her car was found 3 days later in the parking lot of a closed diner near Ravenna, positioned with the same careful precision as the previous vehicles. By December, the Ohio State Police had established a task force specifically to investigate what they privately called the Jennifer cases. Detective Raymond Holbrook, name altered, a veteran investigator with 22 years of experience, found himself studying a map dotted with red pins, each marking a location where a young woman named Jennifer had simply vanished. The geographic pattern formed a rough triangle spanning 3 counties, with each disappearance occurring at increasingly shorter intervals. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Dorothy Brennan, name altered, who operated a small roadside cafe between Akron and Canton, called the police in January 1977 with information that had been troubling her for months. She remembered a man who had visited her establishment 3 separate times during the fall, always ordering black coffee and asking specific questions about the local colleges. He had inquired about student schedules, particularly about when young people typically drove home for weekends. What disturbed Mrs. Brennan most was his interest in the student newspapers scattered around her cafe, specifically the sections that listed Dean's List recipients and scholarship winners. Mrs. Brennan described the man as approximately 35 years old, average height, with thinning brown hair and the kind of forgettable appearance that made him blend into any crowd. But she remembered his vehicle clearly, a dark blue Ford Econoline van with Michigan license plates and a small dent on the passenger side door. The van had been meticulously maintained despite its obvious age, and she had noticed that the windows in the rear cargo area had been painted black from the inside. Detective Holbrook immediately recognized the significance of this information. A van provided the perfect vehicle for transporting unwilling passengers, and the painted windows suggested premeditation rather than crimes of opportunity. But more importantly, Mrs. Brennan's description of the man's interest in student information aligned with the methodical nature of the disappearances. Someone was selecting victims based on specific criteria, and that criteria appeared to include their first names. The investigation team expanded their focus to include college registrars, student newspapers, and campus bulletin boards where personal information was routinely displayed. They discovered that all 3 victims had been featured in their respective campus publications during the month before their disappearances. Jennifer Walsh had received a scholarship recognition. Jennifer Morrison had been named to the Dean's List. Jennifer Kowalski had been quoted in an article about student government elections. Each mention included their full names, their academic standings, and often their general geographical origins. The 4th disappearance, which occurred on February 19, 1977, provided the crucial evidence that would eventually lead to the killer's identification. Jennifer Hayes, name altered, was a freshman at Akron University, a bright 18-year-old studying elementary education. Unlike the previous victims, Jennifer Hayes had told several friends about a stranger who had approached her in the university library 2 days before her disappearance. According to witnesses, a middle-aged man had struck up a conversation about her studies, praising her intelligence and asking detailed questions about her family background. When Jennifer mentioned that she lived in a small town south of Canton, the man had expressed familiarity with the area and suggested they might have mutual acquaintances. Jennifer Hayes had felt uncomfortable enough about the encounter to mention it to her boyfriend, Robert Chen, name altered, who later provided police with a description that matched Mrs. Brennan's account almost perfectly. More significantly, Robert had noticed the man's vehicle when he walked Jennifer to her dormitory that evening, a dark blue van with Michigan plates parked across the street from the campus, positioned where the driver could observe the entrance to the women's residence halls. When Jennifer Hayes disappeared while driving home for her father's birthday, police immediately issued alerts for the Michigan-plated van. The response came within hours from a toll booth operator on the Ohio Turnpike, who reported seeing such a vehicle traveling west toward Toledo in the early hours of February 20th. Additional sightings placed the van at truck stops and gas stations along a route that suggested the driver was returning to Michigan. The investigation now had a clear geographical focus. Detective Holbrook coordinated with Michigan State Police, and within days they had identified 7 dark blue Ford Econoline vans with Michigan registration that matched the physical description. The 3rd vehicle on their list belonged to Harold Vincent Marsh, name altered, a 36-year-old maintenance worker at a community college in Dearborn. Marsh's background revealed a profile that aligned disturbingly well with the emerging pattern. He had worked at various educational institutions throughout Ohio and Michigan since 1972, always in maintenance or custodial positions that provided access to student information and campus facilities. His employment history showed a pattern of brief tenures followed by relocations, often coinciding with the end of academic terms when his absences would be less likely to be noticed immediately. The search warrant for Marsh's residence, executed on March 3, 1977, uncovered evidence that transformed the investigation from missing persons cases to homicide. In a locked storage room behind Marsh's garage, investigators found a collection of personal items that belonged to the 4 missing Jennifers: Jennifer Walsh's class ring, Jennifer Morrison's psychology textbooks, Jennifer Kowalski's Kent State University identification card, and Jennifer Hayes's student newspaper photograph, carefully cut from the campus publication and mounted in a photo album. But the most chilling discovery was Marsh's collection of college newspapers and student directories from institutions across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Each publication had been methodically marked with colored pencils, highlighting students whose first names were Jennifer. Margin notes indicated detailed research into their class schedules, dormitory assignments, and family addresses. The obsessive nature of this record-keeping suggested that Marsh had been planning his crimes for months, possibly years. Under interrogation, Harold Marsh initially denied any knowledge of the missing women, but when presented with the evidence from his home, his demeanor shifted to a strange combination of pride and relief. He began speaking about the Jennifer Project, describing it as a sociological experiment designed to demonstrate the vulnerability of young women who trusted too easily in the safety of their academic environments. Marsh explained his methodology with clinical detachment. He had chosen the name Jennifer because it was common enough to provide multiple targets, but distinctive enough to satisfy what he called his need for thematic consistency. He had studied campus schedules and student publications to identify suitable candidates, then approached them under various pretenses to gather additional information about their routines and family connections. The van served as both transportation and temporary containment, equipped with restraints and soundproofing that allowed him to control his victims without detection. The confession, delivered in a monotone voice over 3 days of interrogation, revealed the fate of the 4 missing women. Marsh had transported each victim to a remote property in rural Michigan that belonged to his deceased uncle, a 40-acre tract of abandoned farmland that provided complete isolation. The victims were held for periods ranging from 3 days to 2 weeks, during which Marsh subjected them to what he described as psychological experiments designed to study human behavior under extreme stress. The recovery of the victims' remains from the Michigan property confirmed the worst fears of their families and investigators. Each had been buried in a carefully prepared grave, marked with a small wooden cross bearing only the first name, Jennifer. The methodical nature of the burial site reinforced the image of Marsh as a killer, driven not by passion or rage, but by an obsessive need to impose order and meaning on his destructive impulses. The trial of Harold Vincent Marsh began on October 15, 1977, in Columbus, Ohio, where the case had been transferred to ensure impartial jury selection. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Margaret Foster, name altered, presented evidence that portrayed Marsh as a calculating predator who had exploited the trust and vulnerability of young women pursuing their educational goals. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity based on Marsh's history of mental health treatment during his military service, but the overwhelming evidence of premeditation undermined any suggestion of impaired judgment. Expert witnesses testified about Marsh's psychological profile, describing him as an organized serial killer whose crimes were motivated by a need for control and a deep-seated resentment toward women who represented educational and social opportunities he felt had been denied to him. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, name altered, a forensic psychiatrist, explained how Marsh's choice of victims with identical first names reflected his attempt to create a fantasy narrative in which he could repeatedly dominate the same symbolic figure. The testimony of surviving family members provided the most powerful moments of the trial. Jennifer Walsh's mother described her daughter's dreams of becoming a pediatrician and her plans to provide medical care in underserved communities. Jennifer Morrison's father spoke about his daughter's compassion for troubled youth and her belief in the power of education to transform lives. Jennifer Kowalski's sister remembered her courage in returning to Kent State, despite the traumatic events of 1970, determined to complete her degree as a testament to the resilience of her generation. Jennifer Hayes's parents shared memories of their youngest daughter's infectious optimism and her plans to teach children in rural communities that reminded her of her own small-town upbringing. On November 30, 1977, after deliberating for less than 6 hours, the jury returned verdicts of guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. Judge Thomas Morrison, name altered, sentenced Harold Vincent Marsh to death by electrocution, noting that the deliberate and systematic nature of his crimes demonstrated a level of premeditation that warranted the state's most severe penalty. Marsh's execution took place at the Ohio State Penitentiary on June 18, 1980, following the exhaustion of his appeals. In his final statement, he expressed no remorse for his actions, but acknowledged that his experiments had failed to provide the insights he had sought. His death certificate listed the cause as electrocution, but those who had investigated his crimes understood that Harold Vincent Marsh had died years earlier, replaced by something that viewed human beings as specimens in a grotesque laboratory of his own design. The Jennifer cases became a landmark investigation that transformed how law enforcement agencies share information about crimes involving mobile perpetrators. The Ohio State Police developed new protocols for recognizing patterns that crossed jurisdictional boundaries, and college campuses throughout the region implemented improved safety measures for students traveling alone. But beyond the procedural reforms and policy changes, the case left a deeper impression on the communities where 4 promising young women had been stolen from their futures. Memorial scholarships established in their names continued to support students pursuing careers in medicine, psychology, history, and education, ensuring that their aspirations would live on in the achievements of others. The families of the victims found different paths through their grief, but all shared a commitment to preserving the memory of daughters whose lives had been defined by hope rather than the manner of their deaths. They spoke at campus safety seminars, supported improved lighting and emergency communication systems, and advocated for legislation that strengthened penalties for crimes targeting college students. Detective Raymond Holbrook retired from the Ohio State Police in 1985, but he never stopped thinking about the Jennifer cases. In interviews years later, he would describe the investigation as both the most challenging and most important work of his career. He often reflected on the randomness that had placed 4 young women named Jennifer in the path of a killer whose obsessions had transformed an ordinary first name into a death sentence. The case files, stored in climate-controlled archives, contained thousands of pages of reports, photographs, and evidence logs that documented every aspect of the investigation. But the most haunting documents were the personal items recovered from Harold Marsh's residence: class notes written in careful handwriting, photographs of family gatherings, letters from home filled with encouragement and love. These artifacts of interrupted lives served as reminders that behind every case number and evidence tag was a human story that deserved to be remembered with dignity and respect. The dark blue Ford Econoline van, held as evidence throughout the trial and appeals process, was eventually destroyed in 1981. Its existence had become too painful a reminder for the families involved, and its disposal marked a symbolic end to one chapter of their long journey through grief and healing. But the lessons learned from its careful examination continued to inform investigations of similar crimes for decades afterward. In the end, the Jennifer cases revealed both the vulnerability and the resilience of communities that refused to be defined by violence. The 4 women who died had been pursuing dreams that reflected the best aspirations of their generation: healing the sick, helping the troubled, preserving history, and educating children. Their murders had been intended to demonstrate human fragility, but their memory became a testament to the enduring power of hope and the determination of those who survived them to create meaning from tragedy. The investigation into Harold Vincent Marsh's background revealed a pattern of disturbance that stretched back to his childhood in rural Michigan. Born in 1940 to parents who operated a small dairy farm outside of Lansing, Marsh had exhibited unusual behavior from an early age that concerned teachers and neighbors, but was dismissed by his family as eccentricity rather than pathology. School records from the 1950s documented instances of Marsh collecting and cataloging dead insects with obsessive precision, organizing them by species, and arranging elaborate displays that he would show to younger children with unsettling enthusiasm. His military service from 1959 to 1963 had been marked by disciplinary problems and what contemporary records described as difficulty with authority figures, particularly women in administrative positions. A psychological evaluation conducted after an incident involving inappropriate contact with a nurse at a base hospital had recommended counseling, but the treatment was never completed due to Marsh's discharge following a reduction in force. The evaluation, buried in his military personnel file and not discovered until after his arrest, contained observations that would prove chillingly prophetic in retrospect. Dr. Michael Harrison, name altered, the Army psychiatrist who had conducted the evaluation, noted Marsh's tendency to view women as objects of study rather than individuals deserving of respect. Harrison had written that Marsh demonstrated an unusual fascination with what he called the predictability of female behavior, describing conversations in which the subject expressed theories about how women could be manipulated through careful observation of their routines and vulnerabilities. The doctor had recommended against placing Marsh in any position that would give him unsupervised access to women, particularly young women away from their families for the first time. After his military discharge, Marsh had drifted through a series of jobs in Michigan and Ohio, always in positions that provided access to educational institutions or youth-oriented organizations. He had worked briefly as a groundskeeper at a high school in Ann Arbor, a maintenance worker at a YMCA camp in northern Michigan, and a custodian at a community college in Toledo. Each employment had ended quietly, often with Marsh simply failing to return after a weekend or holiday break, leaving behind only forwarded addresses that led to temporary housing situations or rooms in boarding houses, where he never remained for more than a few months. The pattern that emerged was of a man who had learned to move through society without forming lasting connections or leaving significant traces of his presence. Colleagues described him as competent but distant, someone who completed his assigned tasks efficiently but never participated in workplace social activities or casual conversations. Several former supervisors mentioned his unusual interest in administrative paperwork, particularly documents that contained personal information about students or participants in programs where he worked. Mrs. Helen Nordstrom, name altered, who had supervised Marsh during his employment at a Michigan community college in 1974, recalled his habit of volunteering to help with filing student records and maintaining bulletin boards where personal achievements were displayed. She had initially appreciated his initiative, but became uncomfortable when she discovered him reading student files during his lunch breaks, claiming he was interested in understanding the educational backgrounds of the young people whose facilities he maintained. When she restricted his access to confidential information, Marsh had become withdrawn and submitted his resignation within 2 weeks. The depth of Marsh's obsession with young women named Jennifer became clear when investigators examined the contents of his residence more thoroughly. Hidden beneath floorboards in his basement, they discovered a collection of journals dating back to 1972, filled with observations about women he had encountered in various settings. The entries were written in a clinical style that mimicked scientific field notes, documenting physical descriptions, behavioral patterns, and personal information gathered through eavesdropping and observation. The journals revealed that Marsh's fixation on the name Jennifer had developed gradually over several years. Early entries mentioned women with various first names, but by 1975, the focus had narrowed exclusively to those named Jennifer. Marsh had written extensively about what he considered the psychological characteristics associated with the name, developing elaborate theories about how parents' choice of names influenced their daughters' personalities and life choices. These pseudo-academic theories served as justification for his increasingly intrusive surveillance and eventual violence. One particularly disturbing aspect of the journals was Marsh's detailed analysis of each victim's family background and educational goals. He had invested considerable time and effort in researching their histories, often driving hundreds of miles to observe their childhood homes and interview neighbors under false pretenses. Jennifer Walsh's entries included descriptions of her family's economic struggles and her determination to become a doctor despite financial obstacles. Jennifer Morrison's section contained observations about her parents' divorce and her stated desire to help children from broken homes. Jennifer Kowalski's entries focused on her survivor's guilt from the Kent State shootings and her commitment to completing her education as a form of honoring those who had died. These insights into his victims' motivations and vulnerabilities demonstrated that Marsh's crimes were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned attacks on specific individuals whose life stories he had studied with the thoroughness of a doctoral dissertation. The personal nature of his knowledge made the crimes particularly heinous in the eyes of investigators and prosecutors, revealing a level of premeditation that went far beyond opportunity or impulse. The forensic examination of Marsh's van provided additional evidence of his methodical approach to kidnapping and murder. The vehicle had been modified with restraining devices welded to the floor and walls, soundproofing materials installed behind the factory panels, and a false partition that separated the driver's area from the cargo space. A small portable generator provided power for lighting and a primitive ventilation system, suggesting that Marsh had intended to keep victims alive for extended periods during transportation. Chemical analysis of stains found in the van's cargo area revealed evidence consistent with the presence of chloroform, indicating that Marsh had used chemical sedation to subdue his victims during the initial stages of their captivity. The discovery of medical equipment, including syringes, bandages, and monitoring devices, suggested that he had maintained his victims in a controlled state while conducting what he described in his journals as behavioral experiments. The remote property in Michigan where the bodies were recovered presented a scene that investigators would later describe as a carefully constructed laboratory for the study of human suffering. The underground chamber where Marsh had held his victims was accessed through a concealed entrance hidden beneath a collapsed barn foundation. The space had been excavated and reinforced with concrete blocks, divided into separate cells that each contained a single bed, basic sanitary facilities, and observation equipment. Most disturbing was the presence of detailed charts and graphs mounted on the walls, documenting Marsh's observations of his victims' psychological deterioration over time. He had recorded their responses to various forms of stress and isolation, noting changes in sleep patterns, eating habits, and emotional states with the dispassionate precision of a research scientist. The charts included notations about which psychological pressures were most effective in breaking down resistance and inducing cooperation. The recovery of the victims' bodies from the burial site revealed additional information about Marsh's ritualistic behavior. Each grave had been prepared identically, excavated to precise dimensions, and lined with plastic sheeting before the body was placed inside. Personal items belonging to each victim had been arranged around their remains in specific patterns that appeared to follow some private symbolic system that Marsh never fully explained, even under intensive interrogation. The psychological evaluation conducted during Marsh's pretrial detention provided insights into the mental processes that had driven his crimes. Dr. Patricia Kellerman, name altered, a forensic psychiatrist specializing in serial killers, spent dozens of hours interviewing Marsh and reviewing his journals and other writings. Her report described a personality structure that combined features of antisocial and obsessive-compulsive disorders with elements that suggested possible schizoid tendencies. Dr. Kellerman noted that Marsh's crimes appeared to be motivated by a need to exert complete control over other human beings while satisfying intellectual curiosity about human behavior under extreme stress. Unlike many serial killers who were driven by sexual or sadistic impulses, Marsh seemed to view his victims as research subjects in an experiment designed to test his theories about psychological manipulation and control. This clinical detachment made him particularly dangerous because it allowed him to plan and execute his crimes without the emotional volatility that often leads to mistakes and capture. The trial proceedings revealed additional details about Marsh's methodology and mindset that had not emerged during the initial investigation. Witnesses testified about strange encounters with a man matching Marsh's description at libraries and coffee shops near college campuses, always asking casual questions about student life and academic schedules. Several librarians remembered helping him locate student newspapers and academic publications, which he claimed to need for research he was conducting on higher education trends. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from a former cellmate of Marsh's from a county jail, where he had been briefly held on unrelated charges in 1975. Robert Martinez, name altered, testified that Marsh had spoken frequently about his theories regarding the manipulation of young women, describing elaborate fantasies about conducting psychological experiments that would prove his theories about human vulnerability and control. Martinez had initially dismissed these conversations as the ramblings of an unstable individual, but recognized their significance when news reports about the Jennifer cases began circulating. Defense attorney James Crawford, name altered, attempted to argue that Marsh's crimes were the result of severe mental illness that rendered him incapable of understanding the nature and consequences of his actions. Crawford presented evidence of Marsh's troubled childhood, his difficulties in military service, and his history of social isolation and unemployment. Expert witnesses testified about the delusional nature of Marsh's pseudoscientific theories and his apparent inability to recognize the humanity of his victims. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that despite any mental illness, Marsh had been capable of extensive planning, had taken deliberate steps to avoid detection, and had shown clear awareness that his actions were illegal and harmful. The evidence of his careful preparation, his efforts to dispose of evidence, and his initial attempts to deny involvement all indicated a level of consciousness and intentionality that undermined claims of legal insanity. The impact of Marsh's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. College campuses throughout Ohio and Michigan implemented new safety protocols that included improved lighting in parking areas, emergency communication systems, and educational programs designed to help students recognize potentially dangerous situations. The Jennifer cases became a case study taught in criminology and law enforcement training programs, illustrating the importance of information sharing between jurisdictions and the need for systematic approaches to investigating patterns of crime. The families of the victims became advocates for improved campus safety and better support for families of crime victims. Jennifer Walsh's parents established a scholarship fund for pre-med students from low-income families, ensuring that financial barriers would not prevent other young people from pursuing careers in medicine. Jennifer Morrison's family created a counseling center that provided free mental health services for college students struggling with family problems and academic stress. Jennifer Kowalski's sister worked with university administrators to develop policies protecting students' rights to academic accommodations following traumatic events, recognizing that survivors of violence and tragedy often needed additional support to complete their education. Jennifer Hayes's parents became involved in efforts to improve communication between law enforcement agencies, advocating for computerized systems that would allow rapid sharing of information about crimes that might be connected across jurisdictional boundaries. Detective Holbrook's investigation had revealed systemic weaknesses in how information was collected and shared between different police departments and agencies. His recommendations led to the establishment of regional task forces, specifically designed to identify and investigate crimes that might be connected across county and state lines. These reforms proved instrumental in solving subsequent cases involving mobile perpetrators who had previously been able to avoid detection by moving between jurisdictions. The media coverage of the Jennifer cases reflected changing attitudes toward crime reporting that emphasized the humanity of victims rather than sensationalizing their deaths. Reporters focused on the educational and career goals that had been interrupted by Marsh's crimes, presenting detailed profiles of young women who had been pursuing meaningful goals rather than treating them simply as statistics in a criminal investigation. This approach helped maintain public attention on campus safety issues while respecting the dignity of those who had died. The execution of Harold Vincent Marsh marked the end of the legal proceedings, but not the end of the case's influence on law enforcement and society. His death was witnessed by representatives of the victims' families, who later described the experience as providing a sense of closure, but not the healing they had hoped it would bring. The finality of Marsh's execution could not restore the futures that had been stolen, or repair the damage that had been done to families and communities. In subsequent years, criminologists and psychologists continued to study Marsh's case as an example of how organized serial killers develop and execute their crimes. His journals and other writings became part of academic research into the psychology of violence, providing insights into the thought processes that can lead individuals to commit systematic acts of murder. These studies contributed to improved methods for identifying and apprehending similar criminals before they could claim multiple victims. The physical evidence from the case was eventually destroyed according to court orders, but the knowledge gained from its analysis influenced forensic techniques and investigative procedures for decades afterward. The methods used to analyze Marsh's van and the underground chamber, where he held his victims, became standard protocols for processing complex crime scenes involving serial killings and kidnapping. The detailed forensic analysis of Harold Marsh's residence revealed layers of evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of a mind completely consumed by obsession. In addition to the journals and personal items belonging to the victims, investigators discovered a sophisticated filing system that Marsh had maintained for over 5 years, containing detailed dossiers on hundreds of young women named Jennifer, whom he had encountered or researched across multiple states. Each file contained photographs taken with telephoto lenses from distances that suggested extensive surveillance, detailed notes about daily routines and class schedules family background information gathered from public records and casual conversations, and psychological assessments written in clinical language that revealed Marsh's delusional belief that he possessed special insights into human behavior. Some files contained evidence of contact attempts that had been unsuccessful, including rejected invitations to social events, and instances where potential victims had recognized his suspicious behavior and taken steps to avoid him. The most disturbing discovery was a detailed timeline that Marsh had constructed, showing his progression from passive observation to active stalking to eventual murder. The timeline revealed that his first serious consideration of violence had occurred in 1974, following a rejection by a young woman named Jennifer, whom he had approached at a library in Detroit. Her refusal to engage in conversation had apparently triggered a psychological crisis that transformed his fantasy life from passive observation to active planning for revenge against women who represented what he perceived as systematic dismissal and humiliation. Dr. Sarah Campbell, name altered, a criminal psychologist who consulted on the investigation, analyzed Marsh's writings and determined that his selection of victims named Jennifer had evolved from practical considerations into a complex psychological ritual. The name had become a symbolic representation of all the women who had rejected or ignored him throughout his life, and his murders were attempts to assert control over archetypal figures rather than specific individuals. Dr. Campbell's analysis revealed that Marsh's crimes followed a pattern common among organized serial killers, but with unusual elements that reflected his particular psychological pathology. Unlike killers motivated primarily by sexual gratification or sadistic pleasure, Marsh appeared to be driven by a need to prove intellectual superiority and to demonstrate his theories about human vulnerability. His journals contained extensive discussions of scientific methodology and hypothesis testing, revealing his delusional belief that his crimes constituted legitimate research that would eventually be recognized for their contribution to understanding human psychology. The investigation team also uncovered evidence of Marsh's attempts to contact academic institutions and psychological research organizations with proposals for studies involving what he described as controlled stress environments. Several universities had received unsolicited research proposals from Marsh between 1975 and 1976, suggesting experiments that would expose human subjects to various forms of psychological pressure while monitoring their responses. These proposals had been rejected or ignored, but they provided additional evidence of Marsh's grandiose self-image and his conviction that his criminal activities served legitimate scientific purposes. The breadth of Marsh's surveillance activities became clear when investigators examined the contents of his van more thoroughly. Hidden compartments contained thousands of photographs documenting his observations of college campuses across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The photographs showed young women engaged in routine activities such as walking to classes, studying in libraries, and socializing in campus common areas, but they had been organized according to complex classification systems that reflected Marsh's obsessive need to categorize and analyze human behavior. Many of the photographs had been annotated with detailed notes about the subject's apparent personalities, social connections, and academic performance, information that Marsh had gathered through eavesdropping and research into student records. The annotations revealed his ability to construct detailed profiles of potential victims based on minimal direct contact, demonstrating the sophisticated planning that preceded each of his crimes. The technical aspects of Marsh's surveillance operation impressed even experienced investigators with its scope and organization. He had maintained detailed maps of college campuses marked with optimal observation points, traffic patterns, and security vulnerabilities. He had documented the schedules of campus security personnel and identified periods when various areas would be less heavily monitored. He had even researched the maintenance schedules of outdoor lighting systems, noting when burned-out bulbs created dark areas that could be exploited for covert observation or approach. The financial records seized from Marsh's residence revealed the extent to which he had devoted his resources to supporting his criminal activities. Despite earning modest wages from his various maintenance jobs, he had invested significant amounts of money in surveillance equipment, vehicle modifications, and travel expenses related to his stalking activities. Bank records showed regular purchases of gasoline, camera equipment, and automotive supplies, along with payments for temporary housing in multiple locations that allowed him to maintain surveillance operations near different college campuses. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Margaret Foster, recognized that the complexity of the evidence required careful organization to present a coherent narrative to the jury. Foster assembled a team of assistant prosecutors specializing in organized crime, forensic evidence, and victim advocacy, ensuring that every aspect of Marsh's crimes would be thoroughly documented and presented with appropriate sensitivity to the families involved. The pretrial proceedings revealed additional evidence that strengthened the prosecution's case, while providing insights into Marsh's mental state during the period when he was committing his crimes. Psychiatric evaluations ordered by the court included detailed interviews with Marsh that were recorded and later transcribed for analysis by expert witnesses. These interviews revealed the full extent of his delusional thinking and his complete lack of empathy for his victims. During one particularly revealing session, Marsh described his victims in purely clinical terms, referring to them by number rather than name, and discussing their responses to captivity, as if they were laboratory animals participating in scientific experiments. He showed no recognition of their humanity or acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused, instead expressing frustration that their deaths had prevented him from completing what he considered important research into human psychology under stress. The testimony of law enforcement officers who had participated in the investigation provided the jury with detailed accounts of the evidence recovery process and the methodical nature of Marsh's crimes. Detective Holbrook's testimony was particularly effective in demonstrating how the investigation had evolved from missing persons cases to a complex serial murder investigation, emphasizing the careful coordination required between multiple jurisdictions and agencies. Officer Patricia Reynolds, name altered, who had been present during the search of Marsh's residence, provided emotional testimony about the discovery of the victim's personal belongings and the impact that the evidence had on the investigating team. Her description of finding Jennifer Walsh's class ring and Jennifer Hayes's student newspaper photograph helped the jury understand the personal nature of these crimes and the deliberate cruelty involved in keeping trophies from the victims. The forensic pathologist who had examined the recovered remains provided technical testimony about the cause of death in each case, while maintaining appropriate sensitivity to the family's presence in the courtroom. Dr. Robert Martinez, name altered, explained that the victims had died from what appeared to be deliberate overdoses of sedative drugs, administered after periods of captivity that had varied in length from several days to more than 2 weeks. The pathological evidence supported the prosecution's argument that Marsh's crimes had been carefully planned and executed with full awareness of their consequences. The systematic nature of the killings, combined with the evidence of extended captivity, demonstrated a level of premeditation that warranted the death penalty under Ohio law at that time. Defense attorney James Crawford faced the challenging task of presenting mitigating evidence for a client whose crimes had been thoroughly documented and whose lack of remorse was evident in his own statements and writings. Crawford focused on Marsh's history of mental illness and social isolation, arguing that his crimes were the result of a severe psychological disorder that had prevented him from understanding the nature and consequences of his actions. The defense team presented testimony from mental health professionals who had treated Marsh during his military service, documenting a pattern of psychological problems that had been inadequately addressed by the military medical system. Dr. Frank Thompson, name altered, a psychiatrist who had evaluated Marsh in 1962, testified that his patient had shown signs of severe personality disorders that should have disqualified him from military service and warranted intensive psychiatric treatment. However, the prosecution successfully challenged the defense's mental illness argument by presenting evidence of Marsh's sophisticated planning and his efforts to avoid detection. The detailed journals, careful surveillance operations, and systematic approach to victim selection all indicated a level of rational thinking that contradicted claims of legal insanity. Expert witness, Dr. Elizabeth Warren's testimony was particularly effective in explaining to the jury how Marsh's psychological disorders had not impaired his ability to understand right from wrong or to control his behavior. Dr. Warren explained that while Marsh clearly suffered from severe personality disorders, these conditions did not meet the legal standard for insanity because they had not prevented him from understanding that his actions were illegal and harmful. The victim impact statements presented during the penalty phase of the trial provided the most emotionally powerful moments of the proceedings. Jennifer Walsh's father spoke about his daughter's dream of providing medical care to underserved communities and the scholarship fund that the family had established to honor her memory. Jennifer Morrison's mother described her daughter's plans to counsel troubled youth and her belief in the power of education and compassion to heal psychological wounds. Jennifer Kowalski's sister testified about her sister's courage in returning to Kent State University despite the traumatic events of 1970, emphasizing her determination to complete her education as a tribute to those who had died during the campus protests. Jennifer Hayes' parents shared memories of their youngest daughter's enthusiasm for teaching and her plans to work with children in rural communities that reminded her of her own upbringing. The defense team's efforts to present mitigating evidence were undermined by Marsh's own behavior during the trial. His apparent indifference to the testimony about his victims' lives and aspirations, combined with his continued expression of interest in the psychological aspects of the proceedings, reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of him as a remorseless killer who viewed other human beings as objects for manipulation and control. The jury's deliberation process was complicated by the extensive evidence presented and the need to consider both the guilt and penalty phases of the trial. Jurors later reported that the most difficult aspect of their decision-making was reconciling the overwhelming evidence of Marsh's guilt with the defense's arguments about his mental state and capacity for rehabilitation. The guilty verdicts on all 4 counts of first-degree murder were delivered after 6 hours of deliberation, with jurors reporting unanimous agreement that the evidence of premeditation and aggravating circumstances warranted the death penalty. The foreman of the jury, Robert Chen, name altered, later described the decision as one of the most difficult of his life, but stated that the systematic nature of Marsh's crimes and his complete lack of remorse left no reasonable alternative. Judge Thomas Morrison's sentencing statement emphasized the calculated nature of Marsh's crimes and their devastating impact on the victims' families and communities. The judge noted that the evidence had revealed a pattern of behavior that demonstrated complete disregard for human life and dignity, warranting the state's most severe penalty as both punishment for past crimes and protection against future ones. The appeals process that followed Marsh's conviction involved multiple levels of review by state and federal courts, each examining different aspects of the trial proceedings and the evidence presented. Defense attorneys argued that the extensive media coverage had prejudiced the jury pool and that the prosecution had been allowed to present inflammatory evidence that had no direct bearing on the question of guilt or innocence. However, appellate courts consistently upheld both the conviction and the death sentence, finding that the trial court had properly admitted evidence that was relevant to establishing the premeditated nature of the crimes and the defendant's mental state. The systematic documentation of Marsh's planning and preparation was deemed essential to understanding the full scope of his criminal behavior and the level of danger he posed to society. The execution of Harold Vincent Marsh took place on June 18, 1980, following the exhaustion of all appeals and review processes. His final statement was brief and consistent with his behavior throughout the trial and appeals process, expressing no remorse for his crimes, but acknowledging that his research had failed to produce the insights he had sought into human behavior under extreme stress. The witnesses to Marsh's execution included representatives of the victims' families, law enforcement officials who had investigated the crimes, and media representatives who documented the conclusion of one of Ohio's most notorious serial murder cases. Family members later described their presence at the execution as providing a sense of closure, though they emphasized that no legal proceeding could fully address the loss and suffering that Marsh's crimes had caused. The impact of the Jennifer cases extended far beyond the immediate participants in the investigation and trial. College campuses throughout the Midwest implemented comprehensive safety programs that included improved lighting, emergency communication systems, and educational initiatives designed to help students recognize and respond to potentially dangerous situations. Many of these programs became models for similar initiatives at universities across the country. Law enforcement agencies adopted new protocols for sharing information about crimes that might be connected across jurisdictional boundaries, recognizing that mobile perpetrators like Marsh could exploit gaps in communication between different police departments. The regional task force approach, developed during the Jennifer cases investigation, became a standard model for addressing complex criminal investigations involving multiple jurisdictions. The psychological and criminological research conducted in connection with Marsh's case contributed to improved understanding of organized serial killers and the factors that motivate their crimes. Academic institutions incorporated case studies based on the Jennifer cases into their criminology and psychology curricula, ensuring that future law enforcement officers and mental health professionals would be better prepared to recognize and respond to similar patterns of criminal behavior. The memorial scholarships established in honor of the victims continued to support students pursuing careers in medicine, psychology, education, and social work, fields that reflected the aspirations of the 4 young women whose lives had been cut short. These scholarships served as tangible reminders that positive outcomes could emerge from tragedy when communities refused to be defined by violence and instead chose to honor memory through constructive action. The families of the victims found different paths through their grief, but all shared a commitment to ensuring that their daughters' deaths would not be meaningless. They became advocates for crime victims' rights, campus safety improvements, and better support systems for families dealing with violent crime. Their efforts contributed to legislative changes that strengthened penalties for crimes targeting college students and improved funding for victim support services. Detective Raymond Holbrook's career was permanently shaped by his involvement in the Jennifer cases, and he continued to work on similar investigations throughout his remaining years with the Ohio State Police. He became a recognized expert on serial crime investigation and frequently consulted with other agencies dealing with complex cases involving multiple jurisdictions. His innovations in information sharing and pattern recognition became standard practices in law enforcement agencies throughout the region. The dark blue Ford Econoline van that had served as Marsh's mobile headquarters for surveillance and kidnapping was eventually destroyed in a ceremony attended by family members and law enforcement officials. The destruction of the vehicle marked a symbolic end to one phase of the healing process, though the knowledge gained from its analysis continued to inform forensic investigations for years afterward. In the decades following Marsh's execution, the Jennifer cases continued to serve as a landmark example of how systematic investigation and interagency cooperation could successfully identify and prosecute serial criminals. The case files became part of training programs for detectives and were studied by researchers seeking to understand the psychological and behavioral patterns associated with organized serial murder. The aftermath of Harold Marsh's execution did not bring the immediate sense of closure that many had anticipated, but rather marked the beginning of a different phase of healing and understanding for the communities that had been affected by his crimes. The families of the 4 victims found themselves navigating complex emotions that ranged from relief that justice had been served to ongoing struggles with grief and trauma that no legal proceeding could fully address. Jennifer Walsh's parents, Margaret and Robert Walsh, names altered, established the Jennifer Walsh Memorial Foundation for Pre-Medical Education, which provided scholarships and mentoring programs for students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds who aspired to careers in medicine. The foundation's first recipient was a young woman from rural Ohio, whose family circumstances closely mirrored those of Jennifer Walsh herself, creating a powerful symbol of continuity and hope that transcended the tragedy of their daughter's death. The Foundation's annual symposium became a forum for discussing issues related to campus safety, student mental health, and the support systems needed to help young people achieve their educational goals despite challenging circumstances. Medical schools throughout the region participated in the program, offering guest lectures, research opportunities, and clinical experiences that honored Jennifer Walsh's memory, while advancing the careers of students who might not otherwise have had access to such opportunities. Jennifer Morrison's family channeled their grief into the creation of the Morrison Center for Youth Counseling, a facility that provided free mental health services for college students struggling with family problems, academic stress, and adjustment difficulties. The center's approach emphasized early intervention and peer support, reflecting Jennifer Morrison's own interest in helping young people navigate the challenges of early adulthood with appropriate guidance and understanding. The Morrison Center became a model for similar programs at universities across the Midwest, demonstrating how campus mental health services could be expanded and made more accessible to students who might not otherwise seek help. The center's research initiatives contributed to academic literature on college student mental health and informed policy discussions about the resources needed to support student well-being in higher education settings. Jennifer Kowalski's sister, Patricia Kowalski Reynolds, name altered, became a prominent advocate for trauma-informed educational policies that recognized the ongoing impact of violence and tragedy on survivors and communities. Her work with university administrators led to the development of academic accommodation policies that allowed students affected by violence or trauma to continue their education with appropriate support and flexibility. These policies, which became known as the Kowalski Protocols, were adopted by colleges and universities throughout Ohio and eventually influenced national discussions about how educational institutions should respond to students who had experienced traumatic events. The protocols emphasized the importance of maintaining educational continuity while providing necessary support for healing and recovery. Jennifer Hayes's parents established the Hayes Rural Education Initiative, which focused on improving educational opportunities and teacher training in small communities similar to their daughter's hometown. The initiative provided resources for rural schools, supported teacher professional development, and created scholarship programs for students planning to teach in underserved communities. The Hayes Initiative recognized that rural communities often faced unique challenges in attracting and retaining qualified teachers, particularly in specialized subjects like mathematics and science. The program's teacher mentoring component paired experienced educators with new teachers working in rural settings, providing ongoing support and professional development opportunities that helped reduce turnover and improve educational outcomes for students in small communities. Detective Raymond Holbrook's involvement in the Jennifer cases profoundly influenced his approach to law enforcement throughout the remainder of his career. He became a leading advocate for improved information sharing between police agencies and played a key role in developing the computerized databases that would eventually allow rapid comparison of crime patterns across jurisdictional boundaries. Holbrook's innovations in serial crime investigation included the development of standardized reporting protocols that ensured consistent collection and documentation of evidence that might be relevant to multi-jurisdictional cases. These protocols became part of training programs for detectives throughout Ohio and were eventually adopted by law enforcement agencies in other states dealing with similar challenges. The regional task force model that had been developed during the Jennifer cases investigation became a template for addressing complex criminal investigations that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. The success of this approach led to the establishment of permanent multi-agency task forces specializing in different types of crime, from organized criminal enterprises to domestic terrorism investigations. The psychological research conducted in connection with Marsh's case contributed to a better understanding of the cognitive and emotional processes that drive serial killers to commit their crimes. Dr. Elizabeth Warren's analysis of Marsh's journals and behavior became part of the academic literature on criminal psychology and informed the development of psychological profiling techniques used by law enforcement agencies throughout the country. Dr. Warren's research revealed that Marsh's case represented a distinct subtype of serial killer characterized by pseudo-intellectual motivations and delusional beliefs about the scientific value of their crimes. This understanding helped law enforcement agencies recognize similar patterns in other cases and develop more effective interrogation and investigation strategies for dealing with criminals who rationalized their behavior through elaborate theoretical frameworks. The media coverage of the Jennifer cases evolved over time from sensationalized crime reporting to more thoughtful journalism that emphasized the humanity of the victims and the broader social issues raised by their deaths. This shift reflected changing standards in crime, reporting that prioritized respect for victims and their families while maintaining public attention on important safety and policy issues. Several documentary films and academic studies examined different aspects of the case, from the investigation techniques that led to Marsh's capture to the psychological factors that motivated his crimes. These productions were carefully developed in consultation with the victims' families and law enforcement officials to ensure accuracy and sensitivity while contributing to public understanding of serial crime and its prevention. The college campuses where the victims had been students implemented comprehensive memorial programs that honored their memory while contributing to ongoing campus safety initiatives. These programs included scholarship funds, speaker series, and research projects that advanced the academic fields in which the victims had been interested, while maintaining visible reminders of the importance of campus security and student support services. The physical locations associated with Marsh's crimes underwent various changes in the years following his conviction and execution. The abandoned steel mill where Jennifer Morrison's car had been found was eventually demolished and converted into a public park that included a memorial garden honoring all victims of violence in the region. The rest stop where Jennifer Walsh's car had been discovered was redesigned with improved lighting and emergency communication systems that became models for similar facilities throughout the state highway system. The remote Michigan property, where Marsh had held and murdered his victims, was acquired by the state and converted into a nature preserve that served both conservation and educational purposes. A discrete memorial marker acknowledged the site's tragic history while emphasizing themes of renewal and the resilience of natural systems in recovering from human-caused trauma. The underground chamber where the victims had been held was filled in and sealed, but the site became part of research projects studying the psychological and environmental factors that contribute to violent crime. These studies contributed to academic understanding of how geographic isolation and environmental factors can facilitate criminal behavior while informing policy discussions about land use and community safety. The dark blue Ford Econoline van that had served as Marsh's mobile base of operations was eventually destroyed in a carefully planned procedure that ensured no trace of the vehicle could be recovered or memorialized by individuals with unhealthy interests in serial crime. The destruction ceremony was attended by family members, law enforcement officials, and representatives of victim advocacy organizations. The forensic analysis techniques developed during the examination of Marsh's van and other evidence became standard procedures used in serial crime investigations throughout the United States. The methods used to document and analyze the modifications Marsh had made to create a mobile kidnapping and confinement facility informed law enforcement understanding of how organized criminals prepare for their crimes. The legal precedents established during Marsh's trial influenced subsequent prosecutions of serial killers and other violent criminals. The court's handling of complex psychological evidence and its approach to balancing defendants' rights with public safety concerns became part of legal education curricula and informed judicial decision-making in similar cases. The appeal process that followed Marsh's conviction contributed to legal scholarship on issues related to the death penalty, mental illness defenses, and the admissibility of evidence in complex criminal cases. While all of Marsh's appeals were ultimately unsuccessful, the legal arguments presented and the court decisions rendered became part of the body of case law that guides criminal prosecutions in similar circumstances. The transformation of grief into constructive action that characterized the family's responses to their losses became a model for how communities can honor victims while working to prevent similar tragedies. The various memorial programs and advocacy initiatives established in the victims' names demonstrated how personal tragedy could be channeled into broader social benefits that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of their deaths. The annual memorial services that commemorated the 4 victims evolved into community events that brought together families, law enforcement officials, educators, and mental health professionals to discuss ongoing challenges related to campus safety, violence prevention, and victim support. These gatherings served both commemorative and educational purposes, ensuring that the lessons learned from the Jennifer cases would continue to inform community responses to violence and trauma. The research initiatives supported by the memorial foundations, established in the victims' names, contributed to academic literature in fields ranging from criminal psychology to educational policy to rural community development. These contributions ensured that the victims' deaths had meaning beyond their immediate tragedy, generating knowledge and understanding that could help prevent similar crimes and support other young people pursuing educational and career goals. The long-term impact of the Jennifer cases on law enforcement practices extended well beyond Ohio, influencing national discussions about serial crime investigation, information sharing between agencies, and the resources needed to effectively address complex criminal investigations. The case became a standard component of training programs for detectives and served as a reference point for developing policies and procedures related to multi-jurisdictional investigations. The psychological insights gained from studying Marsh's case influenced the development of criminal profiling techniques and contributed to academic understanding of the factors that motivate serial killers. The detailed documentation of his planning processes, victim selection criteria, and behavioral patterns provided law enforcement agencies with valuable information about how organized serial killers operate and how their crimes can be prevented or quickly solved. The campus safety improvements implemented in response to the Jennifer cases became models for universities throughout the United States, demonstrating how institutions of higher education could balance openness and accessibility with appropriate security measures. These improvements included both technological innovations like improved lighting and communication systems and policy changes like enhanced background checks for employees and visitors. The victim advocacy programs developed in response to the case influenced state and national policies regarding support for families of violent crime victims. The specific needs identified by the victims' families led to improved services, including counseling, legal assistance, and financial support that helped other families navigate the complex challenges associated with violent crime and its aftermath. The annual conferences and symposiums organized by the various memorial foundations provided forums for ongoing discussions about issues related to violence prevention, campus safety, and victim support. These events brought together researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and community members to share knowledge and coordinate efforts aimed at preventing similar tragedies. The educational initiatives supported by the memorial foundations contributed to improved understanding of the social and psychological factors that contribute to violent crime while providing practical resources for educators, law enforcement officials, and mental health professionals working to prevent violence and support its victims. The autumn silence that had marked the beginning of Harold Marsh's crimes was eventually broken by voices raised in remembrance, in advocacy, and in the continued pursuit of knowledge and compassion that the victims had embodied. Their names, once chosen as symbols of vulnerability by a killer who mistook cruelty for insight, became instead symbols of the refusal to let evil have the final word in any human story. The 4 young women who died had been pursuing dreams that reflected the best aspirations of their generation, and their memory continued to inspire others to pursue those same goals with courage and determination, transforming tragedy into a foundation for hope and renewal that would outlast the darkness that had briefly overshadowed their communities. The legacy of Jennifer Walsh, Jennifer Morrison, Jennifer Kowalski, and Jennifer Hayes lived on not in the manner of their deaths, but in the countless lives that were improved, protected, and inspired by the constructive responses that emerged from the deepest sorrow, proving that even in the face of incomprehensible evil, human dignity and hope could prevail. The comprehensive documentation of Harold Marsh's crimes and their investigation became part of a growing body of knowledge about serial violence that informed academic research, law enforcement training, and public policy discussions for decades after his execution. The detailed records maintained throughout the investigation process provided researchers with unprecedented insights into the planning and execution of organized serial crimes, contributing to improved understanding of how such cases could be prevented, investigated, and prosecuted. The technological innovations that emerged from the need to coordinate information across multiple jurisdictions during the Jennifer case's investigation laid the groundwork for modern computerized crime databases that allow rapid comparison of evidence and patterns across vast geographical areas. The standardized reporting protocols developed during the case became templates for similar systems implemented throughout the United States, improving law enforcement's ability to identify and apprehend serial criminals before they could claim additional victims. The psychological analysis of Marsh's journals and behavior patterns contributed to refined understanding of the cognitive processes that drive certain types of violent criminals, leading to improved profiling techniques and interrogation strategies that enhanced law enforcement's ability to identify, capture, and successfully prosecute similar offenders. The insights gained from studying Marsh's pseudo-scientific rationalization of his crimes helped investigators recognize and counter similar delusions in other cases. The educational initiatives supported by memorial foundations established in the victims' names created lasting institutional changes that improved opportunities for thousands of students in fields ranging from medicine to psychology to rural education. These programs demonstrated how personal tragedy could be transformed into broader social benefits that honored the victim's memory while advancing the same goals and values they had pursued during their abbreviated lives. The campus safety improvements implemented in response to the Jennifer cases established new standards for institutional security that balanced the open, accessible nature of academic communities with appropriate measures to protect students from potential violence. These innovations included both technological solutions like improved lighting and emergency communication systems and policy changes that enhanced background screening and visitor monitoring procedures. The victim advocacy programs developed by families affected by Marsh's crimes influenced state and national policies regarding support services for families dealing with violent crime, leading to improved counseling resources, legal assistance programs, and financial support systems that helped other families navigate the complex challenges associated with criminal victimization and its aftermath. The annual commemorative events organized to honor the 4 victims evolved into important forums for ongoing discussion about violence prevention, trauma recovery, and community resilience, bringing together researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and community members to share knowledge and coordinate efforts aimed at preventing similar tragedies while supporting those affected by violence. The research projects supported by memorial programs contributed to academic literature across multiple disciplines, generating new knowledge about topics ranging from criminal psychology to educational policy to rural community development, ensuring that the victims' deaths contributed to understanding that could help prevent future violence and support young people pursuing educational and career aspirations. The transformation of multiple communities' response to tragedy demonstrated the power of constructive action to create meaning from loss, showing how grief could be channeled into initiatives that honored victims while working to prevent similar suffering for others. The various memorial programs established meaningful legacies that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the crimes, creating positive changes that would benefit future generations. The long-term influence of the Jennifer cases on law enforcement practices, academic research, victim services, and community safety initiatives proved that even the most terrible crimes could ultimately contribute to knowledge and social improvements that helped protect others and advance human understanding. The systematic documentation and analysis of every aspect of the case provided valuable information that continued to inform professional practice and policy development decades after the original events. The courage and determination demonstrated by the victims' families in transforming their grief into constructive action provided inspiration for other families dealing with similar tragedies, showing how personal loss could be channeled into broader social benefits that honored the memory of loved ones while working to prevent similar suffering for others. Their example influenced victim advocacy movements throughout the United States and contributed to improved understanding of how communities could respond constructively to violence and trauma. The interdisciplinary collaboration that characterized the investigation and its aftermath demonstrated how different professional communities could work together effectively to address complex social problems, creating models for coordination between law enforcement, mental health professionals, educators, and community organizations that proved valuable in addressing other types of criminal violence and social challenges. The careful attention to ethical considerations throughout the investigation and subsequent research ensured that the victim's dignity was preserved while generating knowledge that could help prevent similar crimes. This approach established important precedents for how sensitive criminal cases should be investigated and studied, balancing the need for understanding with appropriate respect for victims and their families. The enduring impact of the memorial initiatives established in the victims' names demonstrated the power of education, research, and community action to create positive change that honored the memory of those who died while contributing to the safety and well-being of future generations. These programs showed how tragedy could be transformed into hope through sustained commitment to values and goals that reflected the best aspects of human nature and social organization.